Before we begin, if you enjoy story narrations like this, consider subscribing so you don't miss future ones.
Claire had always liked the way the group met at dawn. It felt like a secret the city had agreed to keep. The members of the Meridian Collective, a name that sounded like a boutique studio rather than anything sinister, arrived with yoga mats, insulated water bottles, and the kind of earnest smiles that made strangers feel like friends. They called themselves a wellness group. They called their gatherings practices. Claire joined because her life had narrowed to two things: a job that ate the hours and a grief that refused to be named. The collective promised structure, community, and a set of routines that could be practiced like a language until the grammar of her days changed. There were breathwork sessions on Mondays, cold plunges on Wednesdays, a communal silent walk at sunrise on Saturdays, and a monthly reset that involved a long, candlelit evening of reflection and intention setting. At first, it was all small mercies. The breathwork calmed the tremor in her hands. The cold plunges made her feel alive in a way that was almost rude. The walks gave her a map of the city she had never noticed, alleys that smelled of citrus, a bench that caught the first light, a willow tree that dripped like a slow fountain. People shared recipes and book recommendations. They swapped playlists. They celebrated birthdays with kombucha and gluten-free cupcakes. No one called themselves a leader. There were facilitators, people who guided a session, who suggested a new breathing technique or a different route for the walk. But the collective prided itself on being horizontal. Decisions were made by consensus in a group chat. New members were welcomed by 2 or 3 people who had been there longer. The rules were simple: show up, participate, respect the practice, and do not bring drama. Claire liked the rules. They were small, manageable things she could obey. She liked the way the collective's calendar gave her life a rhythm. She liked the way the group's rituals made her feel like she belonged to something larger than her own small, private sorrow. She did not notice the pattern at first. It was Tyler who noticed the first odd coincidence. Tyler was a data analyst by trade and a volunteer organizer for the collective. He loved spreadsheets the way other people loved music. He began, as a joke, to map the collective's schedule against local news reports. He wanted to see if the group's events overlapped with anything interesting. He expected nothing. What he found was a line of small, almost invisible overlaps. A missing person report filed the day after a reset. A disappearance that coincided with a new member's first week. A person who vanished after attending a particularly intense breathwork session. The dates were not exact matches, but they clustered around the collective's calendar like moths around a porch light. Tyler brought it up in the group chat with the same casual tone he used for potluck sign-ups. He posted a link to a map with pins and a caption that read, "Weird coincidences? Or just bad luck?" The chat filled with heart emojis and laughing gifs. Someone suggested it was confirmation bias. Someone else said Tyler was being dramatic. A few members privately messaged Tyler to say they appreciated his curiosity, but that he should be careful about making accusations. Claire saw the map. She felt a small, cold thing settle in her chest. She told herself it was nothing. She told herself that the city had always had missing persons, that the collective was small and visible and harmless. She told herself that Tyler was a data nerd who liked patterns, but the pattern kept growing. A reporter from a local paper wrote a piece about a cluster of disappearances in neighborhoods where the collective had a strong presence. The article quoted a police spokesperson who said there was no evidence of foul play and that the disappearances were being investigated individually. The collective posted a supportive message in the chat and organized a vigil. They lit candles and read poems. They held hands in a circle and promised to look out for one another. No one suggested that the collective itself might be part of the pattern. Claire's friend Nora worked at the city's missing persons unit. She had been a detective for years and had the kind of blunt, practical empathy that made people tell her things they would not tell anyone else. When Claire mentioned the collective and the map, Nora did not laugh.
She asked questions. How many members?
She asked. About 60 active members, Claire said. Maybe more. People come and go. Any rituals that stand out? Not really. Breathwork, cold plunges, walks, a monthly reset, candles, silence, people share intentions. Nora made a face.
Intentions, she said.
That's a word people use when they want to feel like they're doing something meaningful.
It doesn't mean anything. Do you think it's connected?
Claire asked. Nora shrugged. I don't know. But if there's a pattern, we should look at it. Send me the map. Claire sent the map. Nora took it to work. She ran the dates against the missing persons database. She checked for overlaps in social circles. She asked for surveillance footage from the areas where the collective met.
She interviewed families.
She found nothing conclusive, but she found enough to be curious. Nora's curiosity was the kind that could become an obsession. She began to attend the collective's public events in plain clothes. She introduced herself as a neighbor interested in wellness. She listened. She watched how people moved through the rituals. She watched how they looked at one another. What she noticed first was how ordinary everything seemed. People laughed at jokes. They complained about work. They brought pastries. They compared notes about therapists. There was no chanting, no robes, no altar. There were no secret handshakes. There was, however, a set of behaviors that repeated with a precision that made Nora's skin prickle. Members arrived early and left late. They checked in with one another. They had a system for pairing newcomers with anchors, people who would stay with them during intense practices. They had a rule about not leaving someone alone after a reset. They had a sign-up sheet for rides home. They had a culture of accountability. It was the accountability that worried Nora. It was the way the group's routines created windows of vulnerability, long, candlelit evenings where people were encouraged to open up, cold plunges that left people shivering and disoriented, breathwork sessions that induced dissociation in some. The rituals were not violent. They were not overtly coercive. They were ordinary practices that, in the wrong hands, could be used to isolate someone. Nora began to suspect that the pattern was not about a single person doing harm. It was about a system. One of the collective's proudest features was its lack of hierarchy. There was no leader to point to. There were facilitators, yes, but they rotated. Decisions were made by consensus. New practices were proposed in the chat and adopted if enough people liked them. The collective's bylaws, if they could be called that, were a set of guidelines posted on a shared document. Consent, safety, confidentiality, and the principle of self-responsibility. This horizontal structure made the collective resilient. It also made it slippery. Nora tried to map the social graph. She identified clusters, a group of facilitators who had been there since the beginning, a cohort of mid-level members who organized events, a rotating group of newcomers. She looked for a node that connected them all. She found many nodes, but none that stood out as a single source of authority. When she asked members who ran the collective, they shrugged. "We all do," they said. "We all hold it. Who decides the reset rituals?" Nora asked. "We do," said Grace, a facilitator with a soft voice and a steady gaze. "We propose, we discuss, we practice consent. If someone feels unsafe, we stop. Has anyone ever felt unsafe?"
Nora asked. Grace hesitated.
"Sometimes people feel overwhelmed. We have anchors for that." "We check in," Nora pressed. "What happens if someone doesn't want to be anchored? What happens if someone wants to leave?" Grace's eyes flicked to the group chat on her phone. "We respect autonomy," she said. "We encourage people to stay. We ask them to consider the work." It was the language that bothered
Nora. Work. Practice. Holding. These were words that framed vulnerability
as a process to be managed rather than a boundary to be respected. They were words that could be used to persuade someone to stay when they wanted to leave. Nora began to interview former members. She found stories that were small and large. A woman who had left after a reset because she felt pressured to reveal more than she wanted. a man who had been encouraged to try a new breathing technique that left him disoriented and who later missed a week of work. A young woman who had been paired with an anchor who became overly attentive and then distant. None of these stories proved anything. They were, however, the kind of details that, when strung together, made a pattern. The first major twist came when a member named Jack disappeared. Jack was a quiet man who worked nights at a bakery. He had joined the collective after a divorce and had found solace in the early morning walks. He was not a central figure. He did not lead sessions. He baked bread for potlucks and brought a steady, calming presence. One Saturday morning, Jack did not show up for the walk. His roommate called the police. The police found his phone at the bakery and his car in the parking lot. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no witnesses. The collective posted a message of concern and organized a search party. Nora was on the search party. She walked the routes the collective favored, calling Jack's name. She checked the places where the group had gathered for resets. She asked people if they had seen him after the last session he attended. No one had. Then Tyler, the data analyst, noticed something else. Jack had attended a reset 2 weeks before he disappeared. At that reset, the group had done a particular exercise, a guided visualization that involved imagining a letting go and then writing down a commitment and placing it in a communal bowl. The bowl was then passed around and each person was asked to read their commitment aloud if they wished. Jack had written something short and private. He had not read it aloud. He had placed it in the bowl and left. 2 weeks later, he was gone. The bowl was a small detail. It was not evidence. It was, however, a ritual element that repeated in other resets. People wrote commitments. They shared intentions. They placed them in a communal space. Sometimes the commitments were read aloud. Sometimes they were not. Nora began to wonder if the rituals themselves created a map of vulnerability. The resets, with their candlelight and confessions, created a record of who had said what and when. The breathwork sessions created states of altered consciousness. The cold plunges created physical weakness. The walks created opportunities for separation. If someone wanted to exploit those windows, they could do so without a leader. They could do so by coordinating through the group's routines. The second twist was more personal. Claire found herself drawn deeper into the collective. She volunteered to help organize events. She became an anchor for newcomers. She liked the feeling of being useful. She liked the way people trusted her. She liked the way the collective made her feel like she had a role. One evening, after a reset, Claire received a message from a woman named Brooke. Brooke had been a member for a few months and had recently moved to the city. She wrote that she felt unsettled after the reset and asked if Claire could meet for coffee. They met at a cafe near the river. Brooke was nervous. She said she had been thinking about leaving the collective, but felt guilty. She said she had been encouraged to try a new breathing technique that had left her dizzy and that a facilitator had suggested she lean into the discomfort. She said she had been paired with an anchor who had been overly solicitous and then vanished. When she tried to set boundaries, Claire listened. She felt protective. She told Brooke she would help. She told her she would talk to the facilitators. She told her she would make sure Brooke had support. That night, Brooke disappeared. Claire blamed herself. She blamed the collective. She blamed the rituals. She blamed the anchors. She blamed the facilitators. She blamed the city. She blamed the way she had not insisted Brooke stay with her after the reset. Nora found Brooke's apartment empty. There were no signs of a struggle. There were no witnesses. The police were polite but non-committal. "We have no evidence of foul play," they said. "We are investigating." The collective organized another vigil. They lit candles and read poems. They held hands in a circle and promised to look out for one another. Claire stopped sleeping. She began to keep a notebook of details: who had been at which session, who had been paired with whom, who had left early. She began to notice small things: a facilitator who always suggested a particular breathing technique, an anchor who seemed to befriend newcomers quickly and then fade, a pattern of people who left the group after intense sessions and then disappeared. She took the notebook to Nora. Nora and Claire began to work together. They interviewed more former members. They mapped social connections. They checked phone records where they could. They asked the police to look at the collective's chat logs. The police were slow. They said they needed warrants. They said they needed probable cause. Nora and Claire did not have probable cause. They had patterns and coincidences and a growing sense of dread. They decided to create their own evidence. They began to attend sessions with recording devices. They took notes. They observed who sat where, who paired with whom, who suggested which exercises. They watched how facilitators handled consent. They watched how anchors responded when someone wanted to leave. What they found was both mundane and chilling. The collective's facilitators were earnest and well-meaning.
They believed in the practices.
They believed in healing. They believed in the power of community. They were not orchestrating disappearances. They were, however, part of a system that created predictable windows of vulnerability. Nora and Claire also found something else: a network of micro-influences. Certain members had a disproportionate social reach. They were connectors who knew people across different neighborhoods. They organized rides, they hosted potlucks, they introduced newcomers. They were not leaders in the formal sense, but they were nodes of influence. When Nora and Claire cross-referenced the connectors with the disappearances, they found overlaps. The connectors had been present at many of the resets and had introduced many of the newcomers who later vanished. But none of the connectors had a motive.
None had a criminal record.
None had a history of violence. The investigation began to feel like trying to catch a shadow. The third twist came when Claire discovered that the collective's routines had been adopted by other groups in other neighborhoods. The Meridian Collective was not unique. There were dozens of similar groups across the city and beyond: wellness circles, breathwork communities, cold plunge clubs, intention-setting circles. They shared practices, playlists, and facilitators. They cross-posted events. They borrowed rituals. Claire realized that the pattern of disappearances was not confined to one group. It was a phenomenon that followed a set of practices. She and Nora began to look at the rituals themselves. They studied breathwork techniques and their physiological effects. They read about the psychological impact of prolonged vulnerability in group settings. They consulted with a neuroscientist who explained how certain breathing patterns could induce dissociation and how cold exposure could impair judgment. They spoke with therapists who warned about the dangers of intense group confessions without proper safeguards. The rituals were not inherently dangerous. They were, however, tools that could be misused. The more Claire and Nora dug, the more they saw how the collective's horizontal structure allowed harmful dynamics to emerge without a single orchestrator. People could coordinate harm through routine. They could exploit trust by being the right person at the right time. They could use the group's norms to normalize behaviors that would be suspicious in other contexts. It was a system of distributed responsibility. It was also a system of distributed culpability. The fourth twist was the discovery of a pattern in the disappearances themselves. The missing people were not random. They were, in many cases, people who had recently made a significant life change: a divorce, a move, a job loss, a new relationship. They were people who had sought the collective for support. They were people who had been encouraged to lean into transformation. Nora and Claire began to suspect that the collective's rituals were acting as a kind of sieve. They attracted people in transition. They created intense emotional experiences. They offered a narrative of rebirth. They promised community. They offered anchors and facilitators who could become confidants. If someone wanted to exploit that, they could identify people at their most vulnerable and then isolate them. But who would do that? And why? Nora and Claire considered motives. Financial gain seemed unlikely. There were no ransom demands. Political motives seemed implausible. The idea of a single predator operating across multiple groups was tempting, but did not fit the evidence. The disappearances were too dispersed, too varied. Then they found a clue that reframed everything, a pattern in the timing. The disappearances clustered around certain calendar dates, dates that corresponded to seasonal rituals, to solstices and equinoxes, to cultural moments when people were more likely to seek renewal. The collective's resets often coincided with these dates. The breathwork sessions and cold plunges were scheduled to align with lunar cycles and seasonal transitions. It was as if the rituals themselves were synchronized with a larger cultural rhythm. Nora and Claire began to wonder if the pattern was not malicious in the conventional sense, but emergent, a byproduct of a cultural movement that encouraged intense vulnerability at predictable times. The disappearances were not orchestrated by a single person. They were the unintended consequence of a set of practices that, when adopted widely, created predictable windows of risk. This realization was both relieving and terrifying. It meant there was no single villain to arrest. It meant the danger was structural. The fifth twist arrived in the form of a confession. That was not a confession. A former facilitator named Simon reached out to Nora. He had left the collective months earlier after a disagreement about consent protocols. He said he had been troubled by the way the group handled intense sessions. He said he had raised concerns and had been dismissed. "I didn't do anything," Simon told Nora in a cafe, his hands wrapped around a paper cup. "But I saw things. People would come in raw. They'd be asked to share. They'd be paired with anchors who were too eager. Sometimes people would leave after a session and not come back."
I thought it was just the city. I thought it was bad luck. Did you ever see anyone being coerced?
Nora asked. Simon shook his head. "No, but I saw how the group normalized pushing boundaries. I saw how facilitators would say, 'Trust the process.' I saw how anchors would say, 'I'm here for you.' I saw how people would rely on the group for everything." "Do you think someone could be using the group to target people?" Nora asked. Simon looked at her for a long time.
I don't know.
"But I do know this. The group is a machine for making people vulnerable. If someone wanted to exploit that, they wouldn't need to be a leader. They just need to be patient and present." Simon's words were not a smoking gun. They were, however, a confirmation of the emergent theory. The collective's practices created a predictable ecology of vulnerability that could be exploited by someone who knew how to be in the right place at the right time. The sixth twist was the discovery of a network. Nora and Claire traced connections between connectors. They found that certain members had ties to multiple groups across the city. They organized rides, they hosted potlucks, they introduced facilitators from one group to another. They were social entrepreneurs of a kind, building a wellness ecosystem. When Nora and Claire dug into the connectors' backgrounds, they found nothing criminal. They found people who had built careers in community organizing, in event planning, in wellness entrepreneurship. They found people who had a talent for bringing others together, but they also found a pattern of opportunism. Connectors benefited from the group's growth. They monetized it in small ways, hosting paid workshops, selling branded merchandise, recommending therapists who took referral fees. The connectors were not criminals, but they had incentives to keep the machine running. Nora and Claire began to suspect that the disappearances were an emergent property of a commodified wellness culture. The rituals that promised healing also created opportunities for exploitation. The horizontal structure allowed influence to be distributed. The connectors amplified practices across networks. The result was a system that, without malice, produced harm. This was not a tidy villain. It was a cultural mechanism. The seventh twist was the revelation that some members had been intentionally manipulating the rituals not to abduct people, but to test the limits of consent. A small group of facilitators had been experimenting with edge work, techniques designed to push participants to the edge of their comfort zones to catalyze transformation. They believed that intense experiences could accelerate healing. They documented their experiments in private messages and in a closed forum. They shared case studies and debated ethics. Some of the experiments had gone too far. People had left sessions disoriented. Some had missed work. A few had left the group and then disappeared. The facilitators argued about responsibility. Some said the work was worth the risk. Others said they had been reckless. When Nora and Claire confronted one of the facilitators, a woman named Rachel, she defended the practice. "We are not responsible for what people do after they leave," she said. "We provide a container. People choose to step into it." "Do you think your experiments could have contributed to the disappearances?" Nora asked. Rachel's face hardened.
I don't know.
"But I won't apologize for trying to help people." Rachel's defensiveness was not proof of guilt. It was, however, evidence of a culture that prioritized transformation over safety. The eighth twist was the discovery of a survivor. A woman named Ivy resurfaced after months of absence. She had been a member of a different wellness group across town. She had left after a reset and had been missing for 3 months. She returned with a story that was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ivy said she had left the group after a reset and had been approached by someone who offered to help her with a job opportunity. She had accepted. She had been taken to a remote house where she had been kept for weeks. She described being isolated, manipulated, and gaslit. She said she had escaped by convincing one of her captors to let her go for a walk and then running. Her story had details that matched other disappearances: the use of trust, the exploitation of vulnerability, the way captors used the language of healing to justify control. But Ivy's captors were not members of the collective. They were a small, opportunistic ring that preyed on people who had been made vulnerable by wellness rituals. Ivy's testimony provided a missing link. It showed how the collective's rituals could be exploited by opportunists who were not part of the group. It also showed how the culture of transformation could be weaponized. Nora and Claire felt both relief and horror. Relief because there was a concrete criminal element to pursue. Horror because the criminal element had learned to use the language of healing to lure victims. The ninth twist complicated everything again. Ivy's captors were arrested. They were a small group with a history of preying on vulnerable people. They had used job offers and romantic promises to lure victims. They had been opportunistic and cruel. The police celebrated the arrests as a breakthrough, but the disappearances did not stop. New people vanished. The pattern persisted. The arrests had not solved the problem because the problem was not only criminal opportunism, it was also the structural vulnerabilities created by a culture that normalized intense, unregulated practices. Nora and Claire realized that even with arrests, the system would continue to produce risk. The collective's rituals would still create windows of vulnerability. Connectors would still amplify practices. Facilitators would still experiment. People would still seek transformation. The problem was not just the predators, it was the ecosystem. The 10th twist was the discovery of complicity in plain sight. A journalist named Lucas published an exposé that traced the wellness economy's incentives. He showed how influencers, connectors, and facilitators monetized vulnerability. He documented referral fees, paid workshops, and the commodification of healing. He interviewed survivors who had been exploited by opportunists who used wellness circles as hunting grounds. The exposé caused outrage. The collective issued statements. They revised consent protocols. They instituted mandatory safety training. They hired consultants. They created a hotline, but the changes were performative in some cases. Some members embraced the reforms. Others grumbled about bureaucracy. Some facilitators quietly continued to experiment. Connectors found new ways to monetize. The city held hearings. The police increased patrols. The media attention faded. The disappearances continued, though at a slower rate. Nora and Claire felt exhausted. They had chased patterns and found systems. They had helped arrest criminals and had exposed structural problems. They had not found a leader. They had not found a mastermind. They had found a culture. The penultimate twist was the most personal. Claire discovered that she had been part of the pattern in a way she had not expected. She had been an anchor for a newcomer named Violet, who had later disappeared. Claire had been proud of her role. She had believed she was helping. She had not realized that her eagerness to hold someone could be experienced as pressure. When Violet vanished, Claire blamed herself. She replayed every interaction. She wondered if she had been too insistent, too persuasive, too invested. She wondered if her kindness had been a kind of coercion. Nora reminded her that responsibility was distributed. "You didn't abduct anyone," Nora said. "You were part of a system." "But I could have done more," Claire said.
I could have insisted she stay. I could have called her family.
"I could have been less performative." Claire's guilt was a mirror of the larger problem. The collective's culture encouraged people to be helpful in ways that sometimes overrode boundaries. People wanted to be needed. They wanted to be part of something. That desire could be manipulated. Claire decided to change how she held people. She began to ask more questions. She began to insist on concrete safety plans. She began to refuse to be performatively supportive. She began to teach others how to hold without owning. Her small changes rippled. They did not stop the disappearances, but they made the group safer in small ways. The climax of the story was not a single confrontation, but a cascade of revelations and actions. Nora and Claire organized a citywide summit on wellness safety. They invited facilitators, connectors, survivors, police, and policymakers. They presented their findings, the rituals that created windows of vulnerability, the network of connectors who amplified practices, the opportunists who preyed on the vulnerable, and the cultural incentives that monetized transformation. The summit was tense. Facilitators defended their work. Connectors argued for autonomy. Survivors told stories that made people cry. The police promised reforms. The city pledged funding for safety training and survivor support. But the most dramatic moment came when a woman named Rachel, one of the facilitators who had defended Edgework, stood up and apologized. She said she had been reckless. She said she had prioritized transformation over safety. She said she had not intended harm, but had failed to foresee the consequences. Her apology was not a confession of criminality. It was, however, a public acknowledgement of responsibility. It was a turning point. After the summit, the collective and similar groups adopted new protocols, mandatory safety training, clear consent procedures, limits on edgework, and a requirement that facilitators be certified by an independent body. Connectors agreed to disclose financial ties. The city funded a hotline and a rapid response team for people who felt unsafe after sessions. The arrests of opportunists continued. The police created a task force to monitor patterns. The media covered the reforms. The public conversation shifted, but the climax also revealed a stubborn truth. Systems are resilient. People adapt. New connectors emerged. New practices were adopted. The culture of transformation persisted because it met a real need. In the months after the summit, the rate of disappearances declined. The arrests of opportunists removed some predators from the streets. The new safety protocols prevented some harms. The collective changed. It became more cautious, more bureaucratic, less spontaneous. Some members left, some stayed. Claire continued to attend sessions, but she did so with a new posture. She asked more questions. She insisted on safety plans. She refused to be performative. She taught a workshop on boundary holding. She helped survivors find resources. Nora continued her work at the Missing Persons Unit. She became an advocate for structural reforms. She pushed for better oversight of wellness practices and for funding for survivor services. She learned to live with ambiguity. The city changed in small ways. There were fewer resets that encouraged confessions without safeguards. There were more certified facilitators. There were more conversations about consent and power, but the story did not end with neat closure. There were still disappearances, fewer but not zero. There were still opportunists who adapted. There were still connectors who monetized vulnerability. The culture of transformation continued to evolve. The final twist was subtle and unsettling. Years later, Claire received a postcard with no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar. The message was short. "Thank you for holding me."
I am safe. There was no signature.
There was no explanation. Claire felt a surge of relief and a new, quieter fear. The postcard suggested that some people had been helped in ways that were not visible. It suggested that some of the disappearances had ended with survivors who had chosen to vanish. It suggested that the line between victim and agent was not always clear. Claire kept the postcard in her notebook. She thought of Jack, of Brooke, of Violet, of the others. She thought of the facilitators who had tried to help and had failed. She thought of the connectors who had built networks that could be used for good or ill. She thought of the collective, which had never had a leader and yet had produced both healing and harm. The postcard did not resolve the ambiguity. It deepened it. The Meridian Collective continued to meet. It changed its rituals. It added safety protocols. It hired certified facilitators. It created a culture of accountability. It also lost some of its spontaneity and warmth. Some members left. New members arrived. The city continued to wrestle with the consequences of a culture that commodified healing.
Laws were proposed.
Regulations were debated. The wellness economy adapted. Nora and Claire remained friends. They had been changed by the investigation. They had learned that systems could produce harm without a single villain. They had learned that responsibility could be distributed and that accountability required structural change. The disappearances never stopped entirely. They became rarer, more visible, and more likely to be investigated. The city learned to look for patterns in routines and to treat vulnerability as a public safety issue. And somewhere, in a small house by the river, a person who had once been part of a reset sat with a cup of tea and read a postcard that said, "Thank you for holding me."
I am safe. They had chosen to leave their old life behind.
They had found a new one. They had not told anyone where they had gone. The collective had not been a cult in the traditional sense. There had been no leader, no doctrine, no robes. There had been, however, a set of practices that created predictable windows of vulnerability. There had been connectors who amplified those practices. There had been opportunists who preyed on the vulnerable. There had been facilitators who experimented without adequate safeguards. There had been survivors who vanished and survivors who returned. The story ended not with a single revelation, but with a series of small reckonings. It ended with reforms and apologies and arrests and postcards. It ended with the knowledge that ordinary rituals can mask extraordinary danger and that the absence of a leader does not absolve a community of responsibility. This story is a thriller built on the tension between ordinary rituals and extraordinary consequences. It explores how a horizontal, leaderless community can produce both solace and risk, and how the search for accountability must move beyond the hunt for a single villain to address the systems that enable harm. The ending is deliberately ambivalent. Reforms reduce harm but do not eliminate it, and some mysteries remain unresolved. The real shock is not a dramatic reveal, but the realization that everyday practices can, in aggregate, become instruments of danger when left unchecked.
Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.